Good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to our panel, How to Craft a Book Proposal with Nicole Chung, Amy Brady, and Tajja Isen, who will be moderating. I'm Krista Diamond. I'm a graduate assistant here at Black Mountain Institute. And thank you to our audience for being here. We also want to thank our event sponsors, Beverly Rogers, Miriam Shearing, the Rogers Foundation, and the College of Liberal Arts for making this programming possible. We have some exciting events ahead that I want to let you know about, especially because I do see a lot of Vegas folks in the chat. So we do have some in-person and virtual events. If you are in Las Vegas on April 18th, James Beard award-winning author of The Meth Lunches, Kim Foster, will be lecturing on the ways food can signify and complicate dysfunction in Las Vegas. It's going to be a wonderful event. There will be food there. On May 2nd, we're hosting a book launch for Wendy Chen's debut novel, Their Divine Fires. And on May 18th at the West Las Vegas Library, join us for Surface Tension, a salon. It's an evening of local artists sharing work around the theme of water. It includes a circus artist, a filmmaker, and soundscape creators, the Nuwu Wonamudga dancers, Clark County Poet Laureates past and present, and special guest Joshua Roman, cellist, composer, and musician in residence at the Las Vegas Philharmonic. And if you're not in Vegas, or even if you are and you like these virtual events, keep an eye on blackmountaininstitute.org for more virtual events like this one and in-person events. With that, we wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities of this region. We are in Vegas here at Black Mountain Institute, as I said, and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwu Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the Indigenous peoples who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Mwapa Band of Paiutes. Our discussion today features 3 nonfiction writers discussing the craft of book proposals. Tajja Isen, Amy Brady, and Nicole Chung will be talking about everything from the way a project evolves, from pitch to execution, to the sections and conventions of a book proposal. Towards the end of the discussion, we will be moving to a Q&A. So like I said, feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat at any point during the conversation, especially questions about those sections of a book proposal. So Tajja, Amy, and Nicole can answer them when the time comes. So today's moderator and current Black Mountain Institute Shearing Fellow, who we're so lucky to have with us in Vegas this spring, is Tajja Isen. Tajja is a writer, editor, and voice actor. Her first book, Some of My Best Friends, was published in 2022 and was named a Best Book of the Year by Electric Literature, The Globe and Mail, CBC Books, and Daily Hive. She is also the former editor of Catapult magazine, and she has also edited for The Walrus, where she is currently a contributing writer, and Electric Literature. And I highly recommend her book. I listened to the audio of it, which she reads while walking down the Vegas Strip, and it was an incredible experience. So I recommend the audio or reading it in print. It's wonderful. Nicole Chung is the author of A Living Remedy and All You Can Ever Know. A Living Remedy was named a notable book of 2023 by the New York Times and a best book of the year by over a dozen other outlets, including Time, Harper's Bazaar, Esquire, Today, and Electric Literature. Nicole's 2018 debut, All You Can Ever Know, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, a semifinalist for the PEN Open Book Award, and an Indies Choice Honor Book. Previously, she was the digital editorial director at Catapult, the managing editor of The Toast, and an editor at Hyphen magazine. Amy Brady is the author of Ice, From Mixed Drinks to Skating Rinks, A Cool History of a Hot Commodity, and co-editor of The World as We Do It, Dispatches from a Changing Climate. Brady has made appearances on the BBC, NPR, and PBS, and serves as executive director and publisher of Orion magazine. She holds a PhD in literature and American studies and has won writing and research awards from the National Science Foundation, the Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference, and the Library of Conference. Congress. And now with that, I will turn it over to Tajja, who's going to chat with Amy and Nicole about this world of book proposals.
Thank you so much, Krista. And thank you, Amy and Nicole, for being here. And thank you to all of you for this wonderful turnout. This is such a joy to bring together brilliant writers and dear friends to talk about this mysterious, vexing genre of the book proposal. I encourage you all to put your questions in the chat throughout. As Krista said, there are a lot of moving parts to a book proposal. We will try to touch on most of them, but if there's anything about which you have a particular curiosity, please feel free to sound off about that specifically, because I really want this event to be as helpful to the maximum number of folks as possible. So to get started, Amy and Nicole, I would love if each of you could speak a little bit about your most recent projects. Amy, your book Ice, Nicole, your book A Living Remedy, and whether you sold them on proposal. And maybe Nicole, you could start us off.
Sure. A Living Remedy is my second memoir. It was just published last year. It's about to come out in paperback. I did sell it on proposal. I sold it, let's see, between the hardcover and paperback tours of my first book. So I guess it sold like spring, summer of 2019. And then the pandemic happened and a lot of other things happened, and I ended up moving my deadline twice. But in any case, it's a memoir that's very different from my first. My first book is so focused on the experience of transracial adoption and the search for my birth family. A Living Remedy is a much like broader book in scope, and it's focused on family and adoption, as well as like healthcare inequality and sort of structural failings that contributed to my parents' deaths. It is very much a grief memoir, but it's also sort of grappling with a lot of the systemic issues like in this country that leave so many people without the help and resources they need when they're ill. So that, I'll stop there, but yes, I did sell it on proposal.
Thank you. Amy.
Sure. So my book, Ice, Mixed Strengths to Skating Rinks, is a 200-year cultural history of ice in the United States. It begins with the dawn of the American ice trade, moves up through the invention of mechanically made ice and the outrageously prudish response that the American people had to such a phenomenon, to the rise of electric refrigeration and a global cooling industry, which is now taking a devastating toll on our planet in an age of accelerating climate crisis. It combines archival research with journalism. So it's a nonfiction book in a lot of different ways. And yes, I sold it on proposal. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you. I guess just to stay with you for a second, Amy, because your book is this 200-year cultural history and kind of comes at nonfiction, as you said, from multiple angles. I'm wondering if you could speak to both, for your book and, if you can, for just research nonfiction in general. How much work does a writer have to do kind of beforehand and incorporate into the proposal versus treating the proposal as like, a statement of work yet to be done, and sort of this is the time and the resources I need in order to answer these research questions?
Thanks so much for that question, Tajja. It was a question that I talked about with my agent a lot in actually developing the proposal. And what I learned is that it really depends a lot on the writer and the subject. For me, I did a majority of the research while writing the book proposal. And I did that for a couple of reasons. The first is that I made the ridiculous choice of focusing on a subject for which there is no single coherent archive. It is, there's no such thing as the ice archive, right? That covers how ice has radically transformed this country and our relationship with cool, which I mean in the temperature sense. And so I wanted to be sure I could actually write a book about this subject and knew where my sources were going to be, and make sure I had enough material to fill in those historical gaps that I was finding at every turn. And so, I probably did 65, maybe close to 70% of my research before the proposal was actually submitted. The other reason why I also did so much research is because I was told, by my agent, and this turned out to be true, that it was likely that the editor who bought it would only give me 12 to 16 months to write it. And, and it turned out like I actually had, on the more generous end of that scale, I think I had around 16 months to write it once it was sold. But, I'm not a particularly fast writer. I run a magazine, I have a day job, and, I knew that I needed to have not just a boilerplate, not just a template, but a strong plan with the research largely, fleshed out if I was going to meet that deadline.
Thank you. I did get one question that I just want to sort of pause and address because I should have mentioned this earlier. I received the question, what does it mean when we say sold on proposal? So just to just to clarify that, thank you so much for asking. Basically, for a nonfiction book, sort of rather than writing the entire manuscript in full and sending that out to having your agent send that out to editors and publishers, you write up a book proposal that kind of outlines what the book will look like, what similar books sort of in the field you would position it alongside, an outline of the chapters, some sample material, and it is very much a kind of statement of work to be done, as well as a preview of what the book will sort of look and feel like. Thank you for asking. Useful information. And Nicole, to ask a slightly different genre question. So you, as you've mentioned, have written and published 2 memoirs. And I know with something like memoir, writers can sort of go either way in terms of selling and writing a proposal versus writing the manuscript in full and treating it as something closer to a novel where, you write the whole thing and send that out. How did you navigate that decision in both of your books? How did you decide that, proposal was the way you wanted to go? And was there anything about selling the second one that was different from the first?
So with both of them, I sold on proposal and very much wanted to do that, in part because I was also working full-time, demanding full-time editing jobs when I was selling and then started to write both books. So, and I had 2, like with the first book, my children were quite a bit younger, and even with the second, when I started it, they were in elementary and middle school. So I did not have a lot of time, and I honestly, I feel like I needed the promise of, I needed the advance, to help cover costs and everything from childcare to just living expenses. And then for me, I also just felt it was going to be difficult to write the entire book without editorial guidance. I've found in the last couple of years, I really enjoy sort of that more open-ended, exploratory writing where I don't always know when I'm working on something, even if I'm working on something for weeks, I'm not always sure exactly where it's going or if it will be published. It's kind of a luxury that I didn't have, especially with the first book. So I was really eager to get the proposal, the idea, into the hands of editors I trusted so that I could have someone to collaborate with. And I still think that's so important. I still really value and learn every time I get to work with a talented editor who cares. So that was part of it. Just I needed the commitment before I was going to sit down and write it. I needed a publisher to financially commit and to put resources forward. And then you asked how the process of selling the second was different from the first. It was night and day, and that was because I had a sales record. And so, whereas the first book was kind of a difficult sell, the second book, which also sold on proposal, the process was similar in terms of me writing the proposal. The components were very similar, but the level of interest and the I don't know how quickly things moved. The fact that the second book sold at auction very quickly, that was entirely different from the process with my first book. And that's just kind of partly the reality of publishing. It's not like I was a wildly different author the second time around, but I mean, having that sales record frankly changed everything.
Thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned the financial aspect as well, because that is also something that is useful about the genre of the book proposal, is that because you are still describing the writing and research that is yet to come. It allows you ideally to get that financial investment from a publisher upfront, so that you can pay for your living expenses, your research, your travel, your childcare while you're working on that project. I also wanted to ask you, Nicole, and also Amy as well, but Nicole, let's start with you. How, with A Living Remedy, you saw the project evolve between proposal and execution, if there was anything about that process that, surprised you.
Yeah, I would say that's true of both books, actually. For me, the most useful part of a proposal is the outline or the summary, the part where you're actually saying, here is the book. Like, I feel like once I've outlined or summarized in that level of detail, then I know that I can write it. It's kind of a roadmap. I mean, I found it enormously helpful both times to have had to do that exercise. That said, with both books, I would say they changed quite a bit in the actual writing, which won't surprise anybody who's written a longer project, or any editors if they're here. Things always change between pitch and publication. And I think writers and editors ideally are both open to that and communicating about those changes. Like, I guess specifics with the first book, there were a lot of structural changes that happened. I'd initially envisioned like a much more chronological story, and in the end, like, it hopped around in time a lot more and place than I had anticipated, in a way that was really rewarding and fun to work on. And it was almost the reverse with The Living Remedy, because in the end, like, the very simplest timeline, relatively chronological, is what helped me unlock that story. But in both cases, the main thing I think that sort of interfered with my little outlines was just life unfolding, and that's very much because of the genre. So you're writing a memoir, but it's based on your life, and you're also living. And as I mentioned, at the time when I pitched and sold my second book, the pandemic happened. My mother became very ill, and sort of the whole scope of that project changed drastically. I feel very lucky that I had an editorial team and a publishing team that were so supportive and open to where it would go, and who trusted me, to follow where the story needed to go when so much had changed.
Thank you. Amy, what about you? How did you see ICE evolve between proposal and finally writing the thing?
Well, like what Nicole said, the outline was hugely helpful. And I had done enough research that I felt pretty comfortable with the outline that I submitted. And for those of you who've never seen an example of a book proposal, or just may not know all of its components, they could take lots of different shapes. But for me, the outline was about a page and a half summary of what I thought most chapters were going to be. And for the most part, they stayed pretty much the same. What actually changed a lot were the sample chapters. So book proposals are often usually, in addition to the fleshed out outline, there's usually one or two or even more, full length sample chapters that you include, that gives an editor a sense of what your writing style is like and what the kind of raison d'etre of the book is. And I had two full length sample chapters. I wildly overwrote them. Every editor who was ultimately interested said, okay, this is good stuff, but we've got to cut this back. And those first two chapters, I ended up breaking apart. Some of the material I deleted. A lot of it ended up in later chapters and was just, rewritten to fit in other places. But I don't regret that work, because I'm somebody who has to write to know what I think and what I want to say. And just the act of writing all of that out, I think ultimately led to a stronger proposal and a stronger book. But there was a lot of change there.
Yeah. I appreciate that both of you mentioned the overview as a kind of, useful guiding principle or mission statement of the book. And just to kind of run through the other components of a nonfiction book proposal. And again, as Amy mentioned, this does sort of change a lot depending on the writer or the agent. But we have that kind of, the overview of the book that does give a sort of high level look at the goals of the project, and what it will do. There's an author bio, there are chapter summaries of, each the sort of, 1 or 2 paragraph long, almost like a pitch for a shorter piece of each component of the book. There's something called the comp titles, which are, as one of us alluded to a while back, the books that you sort of see your book in kinship with. My book is doing something similar to this book and different from it in this particular way. There's a little sort of marketing statement section, and then there's the sample chapters, which we were also talking about. And again, please feel free to pop any questions about any of those specific sections into the chat. But I wanted to ask you, Amy and Nicole, about some of the other sections. So let's start with comp titles. How did you go about collecting them? What felt like the right ones? What do you think makes a strong comp title? Nicole, if you can speak to that first.
So I only learned really in the process of writing my second book proposal that in publishing terms, a good comp title is published recently. I think the number someone gave me was sometime in the last 5 years, and had to sell well, honestly, or they don't care. I mean, I'm being very frank here, but that's what they care about most. You're trying to say look at these other books my book could be on a shelf with, and also look how well they sold. With my first book, with All You Can Ever Know, I had no comps really. There really weren't a lot of books out there about adoption by adoptees. And as I mentioned, it was a tough sell, and I don't know how much my total lack of comps had to do with that. There were also very few memoirs by Asian American women. I could go on. But for the second book, my first book was the best comp that I had. And I was fortunate, to have that by then, and fortunate that the first book did well enough that it was a decent comp. So, I mean, all this to say, the question of how many comps a book should have on proposal, is it even necessary? Does it disadvantage in some way writers from marginalized backgrounds who are underrepresented in publishing? I mean, I think those are worthwhile points and discussions to be having. I haven't heard anybody suggesting that we get rid of comps altogether. So if I write another nonfiction book proposal, I know it's going to have to be in there, but it is a section that I sort of approach with some anxiety, just because, again, with my first, I did not have any. And I think that's the case for a lot of writers, especially ones who are underrepresented in the literary landscape.
Yeah. There's this great article by an academic called, I think her name is Laura McGrath, called Comping White, that was published, I think, in the Los Angeles Review of Books, that sort of unpacks the logic of comp titles and how it is, a disadvantage to writers from marginalized backgrounds, because so often publishing wants to see, thank you, Nicole, evidence that what has worked before will work again, and that logic sort of anyway, it's a great article. Suggest you read it. Amy, can you talk about your comp titles a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, Nicole said, the comp titles signal to your potential editor that your book will also sell, right? Because you're showing that other books kind of sort of like it have gained an audience. One thing that I like about gathering the comp titles is that it helps to show the various ways in which your book can reach an audience, right? So, for example, with ICE, I basically broke my comp section into 2 larger categories. There were the so-called object histories, right? Think about the Mark Kalanskys of the world, the people who take one thing like salt and then write an entire book about it. So I had those comp titles. But then my book also throughout is essentially a cultural history of the climate crisis. And I wanted to show that readers who are interested in thinking about the environment and planetary impacts would also be interested in it. So I had a separate comp section about climate crisis comps. And, you know, and maybe I'm just, you know, a real nerd when it just kind of comes to thinking about, you know, like the shapes of projects and stuff. But as anxiety producing as that process was, it did help me early on to find, or maybe I should say more greatly define the borders of my project, you know, by saying like, you know, I could write about ice in a million different ways, but I actually want to write it as an object history and as a commentary on the climate crisis. And that helped to keep me in line more than anything else.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. I am seeing some questions in the chat that I want to sort of weave into our conversation before we formally break, because I don't want to miss any of them. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask both of you about were the sample chapters, both sort of, you know, how you chose what to include as sample material, what you think makes strong sample material, but also about how long it was. The question in the chat is, what is the length or average word count of a book proposal? I suspect this also varies, you know, based on the project and based on the agent, but at least the number that I have been quoted is sort of somewhere in the range of like 15 to 25,000 words. I don't know if both of your experience has been different, but yeah, just sort of average length and maybe how you put your sample material together, what you wanted to include. Amy, maybe you could start us off.
Sure. Sorry, Tajja, you mean about the sample chapters specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had no idea how to start with that. You know, it's interesting. I'm working on another book proposal right now, actually, for my next project, and I'm approaching it a lot differently. For the ice book, since I didn't know where to start, I just started at the beginning, and I drafted what eventually would become the first and second chapters of the book. And that worked. That was fine. You know, it gave the editors quite literally a sense of where the book was going to begin and how the reader would first encounter my book. And it was great. But, you know, in talking to my agent and talking to other writers, I found that there are so many different ways of going about it. And for this next proposal, I'm taking a slightly more strategic approach. And the first chapter I'm drafting, I would actually will doubt very much that it'll be the first chapter, but it's the first one that I think I want to try to publish elsewhere as a separate article, and to help, you know, to generate some early, you know, excitement or at least thinking around what this book could be. And it might appear anywhere in the book. I haven't gotten far enough yet to know. And all indicators have suggested that that is fine. I'll let you know if it's not.
Nicole, how about you with sample material?
Let's see. As for how to decide on it, so there, you know, some people really tell you that you should have the beginning of the book. Editors want to know how it begins, and I think that's fair. And Amy, as you were talking, I was like, yes, that's so smart that you ended up with the first two chapters the first time. I've never done that. I send what I have written and like what I think is ready, and also like, you know, someone else had told me when I was first starting to, just before I even had an agent, I was just like researching what goes into a book proposal and also how do you get an agent. And, you know, advice I found was you send your best work in the book proposal, whatever that is. And so like I had a couple essays I had workshopped and reworkshopped and like had maybe published one or, you know, one of them before for the first book. And that's what went out with the proposal, because I knew they were strong. They'd been edited, you know, one of them had been published. And so I was confident in the quality. And then with the second book, similarly, I think I had, so I think I sent 2 sample chapters with each, but I had a couple more in reserve in case editors were interested or like on the fence and wanted to see more. Because I was trying to not have the proposal be like 80 pages long. And so, yeah, so with each of them I sent out 2 and I had a couple as backup. And I just sent what was done, what I thought was ready, and what was strong.
Thank you. Let's talk about sending them out. Let's talk about responses that we get from from editors once the proposal has been, sent out into the world. I guess was there anything about editorial responses or has there ever been anything about editorial responses to the project that kind of, surprised you, illuminated something about either the project or, the genre of the book proposal that, usefully changed the way you thought about the project, made you doubt the way the book proposal is structured or the thing that it is meant to do in the world? Because I feel like, just to sort of speak to my own experience here, I've often, felt like I've drawn up a proposal that speaks as clearly as possible to my intentions for the project, and I'm like, there is no way this could possibly be misinterpreted. And then, it gets sent out into the world, and I get responses back that that kind of illuminate the gap between the many different versions of the book that can exist between proposal and execution. So maybe to winnow that down, have responses from editors made you rethink anything about the genre of the book proposal in general? Nicole, do you want to start us off?
I feel like I was just like very unaware going into the first book proposal and the first publication experience of like how publishing worked. And so I was thinking, and I came at this as an editor, by the time I sold my first book, I had been working as an editor for several years. And I was like so eager to just like find a great editor to work with who would like strengthen my writing, see the story. I wanted to write, be excited about it. Like I wanted to write the very best book I could. And that was like what I was focused on. I think that is what writers need to be focused on, by the way. I mean, I think the writing is everything. But I really underestimated like how much sway often there is like in before a book is acquired from like other departments, so say publicity and marketing, do the people who have to sell it is their job, to be fair, like think they can sell it, do the people who have to market it see a market for it, and that's what makes the proposal so tough. It is both a creative writing flex because the writing has to be there, your voice has to be there, and everyone has to be able to read it and get what your project is. But also it is a marketing document. Like it is a cold, hard marketing document as well. That is like a tough needle to thread. I don't often get like super specific feedback from editors who passed. With the first book though, I remember having discussions with editors and there wasn't feedback directly from them. It was usually like marketing or something, but they were the ones relaying it to me because the editors were, if they bothered to talk to me, they were interested, they were somewhat excited about the project. But one person said like, marketing isn't sure there's a market, we don't know if we can sell it. And then one person was like, oh, do you think anybody will read it if they're not Korean and adopted? I have told this story many times. My apologies to those of you who've probably heard it before, but like that really summed up a lot, I think, of like some of the barriers, the real barriers that do exist in publishing for writers who are trying to write something maybe that hasn't been done before, or just writers who do come from, like, again, underrepresented backgrounds. I can't say it was a good lesson, like a fun lesson to learn, but I think it was sort of an important one. And the thing is, once you have that sales record, like all bets are off. Like the only important thing then with my second book, to be honest, was that like my first book, I could say like, look, this is what has happened. But I don't know, like it was just, I wouldn't say the feedback changed how I thought about my projects or my writing or what I wanted to do. It just kind of made me aware that like, while I was focused on the writing as the only or the most important thing, publishing is a business driven by capitalism. And so, they're also thinking about other things, and it's an industry driven by capitalism that's like 85% white. So there's that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for highlighting the strange tension between the document being a creative flex and a cold hard marketing document, because I feel like that's such an important point and such an important thing to keep in mind. And like, even as like I'm even as it is a sort of business proposal, I find it, at least personally, helpful to think of it as also a sort of creative articulation. So I'm glad you highlighted that tension. Amy, what about you? has, did some of the responses that you got from sending out ICE change the way you thought about book proposal as genre or the project itself?
Yeah, like it sounds like with Nicole's experience, the editors who passed don't offer much in the way of feedback. I was fortunate in that most of them were very polite. But there really wasn't much feedback. But interestingly, one of the editors who was interested that I ultimately ended up not working with, just based on the proposal, said to me that if we were to work together, one of the things that he'd want to clarify is this book veering too much into a series of mini biographies? Because the sample chapters that I gave focus so heavily on the key historical figures that made America obsessed with ICE. Is that the direction we really want to go in, or do we want to focus more on the actual outcomes or the impacts that their original vision had? And I'd never thought about that. I was just thought I was just so interested in who these people were that I didn't think about the fact that the book could come across as a series of biographies. And so I kept that in mind, even though I went with another editor, I actually kept that in mind quite a bit when I was writing. And then what also kind of added to some initial confusion is that the initial editor that I went with, who did not say that, actually said to me, there really should be more of you, Amy, in this book. Because there are sections in the book where I slip into the first person and just talk about some of the moments in my research that either surprised me or quite frankly, I found hilarious.
Yeah.
And I thought, if I find it really funny, I think my audience is going to find it funny. So I want to write about those moments. And she's like, lean more into that. And first person writing is not something as a writer I'm super comfortable with. So I had to kind of find ways that I could do that. But all of that was just in response to what was in the proposal. And I like to think that the ultimate, product feels like a coherent whole, and all of those approaches came together. But yeah, it was just, I guess, just to say it was the editors that were interested who ultimately had the most impact on the writing.
Yeah, it totally like I love the way that your book feels like it feels sort of threaded together as a travelogue, as we've talked about. And I love I love the moments of Amy, the researcher reporter out there in the world, learning like incredible things about ICE. I am going to pivot to some of the questions from the chat, which are super interesting and picking up on a lot of similar themes. We have a couple of questions about sales. An earlier one in the chat that admittedly is kind of hard to give an easy answer to. What is considered doing well for selling a book? But perhaps a more concrete way of coming at this would be what is the tipping point where previous sales opens the door, as Nicole mentioned a couple times with just having a sales track. How many books sold on one title opens doors? And I would have to say it really depends. It depends sort of who publishes the book, what their, expectations are, whether it's a small press, major press, how much attention they give it. It's kind of infuriatingly hard to distill for something that can, as the question rightly acknowledges, kind of set the stage for whatever comes next. Do either of you want to speak to that, or is it just kind of like I throw my hands up in the air?
I'll say I don't actually know what my sales are. Some writers try to, I guess I find them out when I get my royalty statements, but that's the only time I'm really aware. That's not info that I try to obsess over or go looking for, because it makes me really anxious. And then I feel like I'm focusing on the wrong things. But I will say, since I mentioned sales a couple of times, which is maybe gauche, I'll point out too, there's so many ways for a book to be successful. I guess from just the standpoint of a writer, something I tell debut writers sometimes is that sometimes the things that you think or hope will happen for your book don't happen, but what makes it great or bearable, if you want, it is that great things you never imagined happen, like little like moments of connection, whether that's with like readers that you meet or like a particularly wonderful like interview you get to do, a conversation you get to have. I really love going on tour because I love the conversations that happen quite often with friends. And like that's really exciting. So I don't know, just like things that you can never predict, but like turn out to be wonderful. I mean, I'm not trying to like, you know, to say that like sales are money or making a living at this doesn't matter, because it does matter and writers should be able to make a living. But I do think there's just so many other great things that can happen for a book. It's not all about sales. It's not all about awards. Like there's just so many things you won't think to look for that will happen. Like I guarantee it. So and every book can help open a door to another project. So I'm not really sure like I can like name a tipping point. You know, I'm not sure that really exists. Tajja, you're so right that it depends on like this press and how much they've invested in it and you know all of that. But like ultimately, if it's a book that you, the writer, can feel good about that makes you feel like you could and want to write another book, I think that's very important too.
Yeah, definitely. Amy, is there anything you want to add to that? You can also pass if you would prefer.
Well, maybe just to reaffirm, not that I ever need to reaffirm what Nicole says, but just to say in my experience too, I have no idea what my sales are. I have no idea. And I have just decided for myself that I don't need to know. And if numbers aren't going to be the barometer for success for me, if I'm not going to try to quantify it in that way, then I needed to find another way to consider it to be a success. And for me, I mean, this is a book. This is a book where there's a lot going on in there. It's a history book about ice. It's also a book about cocktails and sports and Victorian social mores around love, romance, and sex, and the climate crisis. There's a lot going on there. And what I've found is that that book, therefore, has been at the center of some interesting conversations. And one of the ones that I'm most proud of, and what I do consider to be a barometer of success, is that I've been a part of conversations now with people who are trying to historicize the climate crisis, which is an approach that in the public sphere, to my mind, not enough people are doing. Like looking at how did we actually get here? And if we know where we're coming from, is there a way that we can alter our trajectory into the future? And the fact that I, am a part of those conversations, I might even dare to say this book helped to spark some of those conversations. I'm really proud of, and even if I've only sold 2 copies, to my mom and, Tajja, you once told me you bought a copy. Thank you. I've probably sold 2 copies. I feel like it's a success because of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with, finding different ways to finding alternative barometers of success that are not the single template that the publishing industry kind of imposes on a project. Somebody in the chat did point out that, if one has earned out one's advance, i.e. sold enough copies that the publisher has made back the amount that they paid you for the proposal, then that would indicate sales success. And while that is true, I think the statistic is something like 90% of books don't earn out. It's quite alarming. Publishing is like financially wild.
Sorry, so that makes me like remember a story, which is not my agent, but like an agent told one of my writer friends that if one of their authors earned out, they felt they hadn't done their job well, like they left money on the table essentially, because an advance is the publisher's risk, really. But like as the writer, if you're waiting on hoping for royalties to make it financially worthwhile, like that's kind of risk you assume or the work assumes. So yeah, I mean, I've thought about that because some people will frame it as though if a book doesn't earn out the advance, it's not like successful, but like it still could be pretty successful for that writer. And like it allows that writer to make a living and maybe write more books, like so.
Yeah, totally. I think I feel like I heard this story about like Andrew Wiley, the famous agent. He said like if a writer earns out, then I haven't. Like my job is to make sure that never happens. It's to get them the maximum amount of money up front. There's a couple questions about agents and how that sort of intersects with the proposal question. someone asks, is the proposal that you'd send to an editor the same kind of proposal you would send out to get an agent? Which is an excellent question. Do either of you want to speak to that? I'll say that often when you're querying agents, it's a highly individualized process. Each agent will kind of specify what it is they are, what it is they're looking for in a query. Whether that's like, you know, first couple chapters, first 100 pages, first chapter, what the letter should be formatted like. And then often if you sign with that agent, they will have sort of individualized preferences as to how they suggest you format your book proposal. Do either of you want to add anything, or does that feel kind of...
I think that's true. I think the main question an agent has when they're considering taking on a writer is, what is the book? I mean, this is why agents stay in touch with so many writers and like keep following up with them, is like quite often when, like, let's say an agent reaches out to you, maybe because you've published an essay or a story that they saw and liked, and they're interested in your work. I mean, you could be in touch with them for a while if you don't have like at that moment, like a book idea ready to go that you can clearly articulate, and that the agent can imagine well enough to think about whether they can sell it or not. So I mean, when I was an editor, I saw this all the time, like where my writers would publish something brilliant, and like, of course, agents would reach out to them, and the writers would go, "That's so great and exciting. Like, what do I tell them?" And I'm like, tell them whether you have a book idea. If you don't have a book idea, keep in touch till you have a book idea. But I think that's the main thing, is like, what is the project? Do you have a clear vision for it? Can you articulate that vision to the agent? And yeah, I'll stop there, but yeah.
Another really, oh, sorry, Amy.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was also just going to say that, remember, your agent is the expert at selling it to editors. That, as a writer, is the one thing that you don't necessarily have to be an expert in. You know, once you get the agent, they will help you. My agents really helped me to further develop that proposal so that it would be appealing to an editor. So, you know, your proposal needs to be good enough to get an agent, not necessarily keyed towards getting an editor.
Yeah. And just in response to the latest question in the chat, what happens if no publishers pick up an agent represented proposal? I would not say that necessarily means it's dead in the water. I think often what happens is, you know, you will have to go back to the drawing board, often with your agent, to kind of retool the proposal and figure out what's not working. You may send out a revised version of the proposal. You and your agent may decide together that the wise thing to do is actually to sort of write more of the book and kind of answer those editors' questions, or sort of, you know, give them more of the book so that there are fewer questions to ask and it's clearer what the execution will be. Sometimes, you know, in the case of memoir, I've heard writers sort of write the whole thing, write the whole manuscript, then take it out again, or so there's always, you know, there are always other options. It doesn't mean that book idea is dead and gone and you can never, you know, revisit it again. It just means that nobody responded to the proposal, which, you know, you just have to find a different way of selling it. There's a question here that I really like. Do you have advice or words of courage for writers who tend to find the shape of their projects through writing, but also want to get a move on with their proposals for the reasons you've named, i.e. having a collaborative relationship with an editor, getting the money up front? How do you balance the book writing process with the proposal writing process? Would either of you like to tackle that one? I can start us off if it's too big. I mean, like, that's such an important question. I mean, I think for as helpful a creative document as the book proposal can be, it is, at least for me, it's been useful to have a version of the project that like lives outside of that and is entirely separate from that. And even if I'm writing something that I think is going to be my sample material, I almost want to wear different hats when I'm like dropping it into the document that's called book proposal doc X versus like manuscripted progress or whatever I've called it, which is usually something like blah. Because I think, yeah, I guess I think of it almost as like working on two projects or two pieces at once. There's, you know, the creative and the commercial, and like the two can intersect occasionally, but I think, at least for me as a writer, it serves me to almost like I'm working on different, today is going to be my book proposal day, tomorrow is going to be my manuscript day, where I'm not going to worry about market pressure, and I'm not going to worry about how to position this. I'm just going to worry about sinking into the project as, as deeply as possible.
I love that answer. I think I do something similar, although like again, I haven't like sat down and tried to write a book without having like sold a proposal. For all the reasons I mentioned before, just sort of practical ones. But it also helps me like I like marching orders. I like a list. I like to know I can count on something. And for me, neither book felt fully real, like real enough to make a ton of progress. And that's just me. Again, like I know people write entire books not having sold them. But I don't know, I needed collaboration. I needed to know there was commitment also, from the industry. And I guess it needed to feel real to a certain degree before I could like really sink deeply into it. So I don't know, that's like very particular to like me maybe and to those two projects. I'm not sure it'll be like that, going forward.
Yeah, for me, I found the book writing and the proposal writing to be a reciprocal process, that they tended to inform each other. And when I got more excited about my book proposal, I was ultimately more excited about my book. And weirdly, vice versa. It's a weird thing to say you're excited about a book proposal, but it's true. And I think to go back to, for example, the comp section again, to look at other titles really helped me to find the edges of what my project was going to be. And then, I'm a writer that writes well with imposed limitations. So, now knowing what the limits are going to be, for example, I was like, oh, okay. So now chapter 4, for example, is going to have to be about this because I can't go in this direction. So I tried to see those two as complementing each other and helping each other to evolve. And that helped me to keep up the momentum.
Thank you. I love this recurring theme of like like limitations and structure is really important. And that is something that I think is useful about the book proposal, is that, if somebody says, I need you to articulate the elevator pitch of this project, and I need you to be able to tell me what this book is in like 800 words, that is never not going to serve you as a writer. Just going through the questions here. There are a few about memoir specifically. Katie asks, how much of an advantage is it to have a fully finished memoir? And I hate to keep being this guy, but I think it depends. Like,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it is an advantage. I mean, I'm not an editor. I don't work in publishing anymore. But I think a lot of editors and publishers like who are used to taking a lot of projects on proposal, like memoirs or reported nonfiction, they enjoy working in those genres and publishing them in part because they like to get in the weeds with the writer and they want to be involved in sort of it's a delicate balance, right? Like you have to sort of strike that balance between like being very involved and not being too involved, like making sure the writer feels confident doing what they need to do, and that making sure that you like let them take the lead, but also like actually being helpful. But I think editors who edit these genres and take work on proposals, like that's one of the things they really love about it. So I don't know, like I'm not sure it is a great advantage, but if I'm wrong about that, like I apologize. I've never sold a book, like a memoir, not on proposal, and I also like most of the people I know who write in the genre have sold on proposal as well. That's my experience.
yeah, and I think when you send the proposal out, what you're trying to find and what you're trying to gauge is somebody who has a vision for the project that aligns with yours as a writer. If an editor is interested, you'll get to take a meeting with that editor, and they will sort of tell you based on the material that you've given them how they would continue to shape the rest of the book. And in an ideal situation, that vision is aligned with yours. And if they say something that's like, totally off base,
Yeah.
then, maybe you don't want to work with that person. We have, I mean, are you both open to like speaking to questions that are not book proposal specific? Is that okay? Because there were, let's see, we have, okay, so I'm just gonna try to hit these as quickly as I can. What is the typical advance for nonfiction books? It depends. It depends on how many editors are interested, the nature of the, is it reported? Does it require a lot of travel? Is it heavily researched? How many years is it gonna take you? What sort of profile do you have as a writer? But it could just be a matter of like lots of people get really excited about it at the same time. Okay, I'm gonna ask a question of my own to close us out. Oh, okay, sorry, I've seen one more question. The involvement of editors. Yes, I think the editors that we've been talking about are with publishing companies rather than hiring an external editor. Which sections of the book we've talked about, which we found the most helpful, the overview being a useful guiding principle. What section do you find the hardest?
All right, which section of the book proposal do I find the hardest? I hate the whole marketing comps section, and if I could leave it out, I would.
Fair. Amy, what about you?
Well, I am the oddball who does value comps some of the time, but I find them very frustrating. For me, the hardest part is the marketing and publicity. Because essentially what that proposal is asking you to do is to quantify your public life. And I find that to be really obnoxious and difficult. I mean, I'm literally saying that there are some, relationships that I have with people in institutions that are more valuable than others because they get listed as potential ways to partner and ultimately sell the book. It's also that section kind of drives home, at least it has for me, the areas in which I haven't accomplished as much as I'd want. Right. And so it's, I find it existential in a way that I really dislike. And I wish that I could eject it. But since it's a sales proposal, that is arguably one of the most important sections of the proposal.
I actually didn't do that. Like I had like a marketing section. I didn't sit here and list, I know this person, and this. Like, I think I just didn't know how to do that really with the first proposal. And with the second, I was like, I don't know, just like not focused on it. And then I guess if I'd been pressed, if they were like, who does Nicole know? I would have come back with a list, but we just sent it out. We just simply like sent it out. But I think, I don't know, like maybe I should have like done that. My agent didn't emphasize it to me. So I have heard of the like sections like that in proposals, and it's probably smart, but like neither of my proposals really included that. So now I'm questioning how much I really know about this process.
Which I think is a great place to end. Thank you both so much for your candor. Thank you all for your engagement and your questions and your participation. This has been really helpful for me just to sort of articulate. I'm sorry, so many of the answers are just, it depends, but I hope that also strikes you as empowering, as it is highly individualized, multifactorial, and it is wild out there. So thank you all so much. Thank you to Black Mountain Institute for letting me propose this event. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.